In 1915, Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was looking for a mechanical way to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Churchill wanted a machine that could cross the muddy, cratered terrain of no man's land, while also being able to withstand the onslaught of machine gun fire.
"We must crush the trenches in," he said. "We must crush them in. That is the only way."
So he set up a committee to build what he called land ships. Attention quickly turned to a curious prototype from 10 years earlier. Back in 1904, Grantham engineer David Roberts had devised a brilliant off-road alternative to wheels for a new tractor, his chain or caterpillar tracks. This is a 1/3 scale model of his steam-powered Hornsby chain track tractor. The original weighed 40 tons, but the tracks spread the weight over a large area of ground, so it didn't get bogged down in the mud. The vehicle looked like a winner, and the version was offered to the Army as an artillery tractor to pull heavy guns. The Army hardly leapt up and down with excitement at the idea. They bought a petrol version as a tryout, but one Royal Artillery officer declared, "Its noise and smell are abominable. A team of 8 horses is far superior under every condition." And they dropped the order. But a few years later, Churchill's Landship Committee would turn Roberts' idea into a revolutionary new weapon. The plan was to combine caterpillar tracks with the armour of armoured cars to make a machine that could withstand bullets and go over trenches. The brains came in particular from 2 men. Walter Wilson was an engineering genius working in the British Army, while William Tritton was the general manager of Foster's, a small Lincoln engineering company. After trying many ideas, this is the vehicle they came up with. Little Willie, the world's first tank. It weighed 14 tons, carried a crew of 3, and had a top speed of a little over 3 miles an hour. In trials, the new Caterpillar track worked well, and Little Willie would be able to cross a muddy, bumpy stretch of no man's land without difficulty. But there was a flaw. So here we are across no man's land, approaching enemy trench. Whoops. If a particular trench was too wide, Little Willie simply couldn't bridge the gap, and her Caterpillar tracks couldn't pull her out of the trench. It was back to the drawing board. The new tank was much bigger, long enough to cross trenches. But as soon as you see it, the thing that makes it immediately different is that the tracks were wrapped all the way around the hull. And here's the clever bit. The rhomboid shape of the tank gives this shallow angle of track at the front, so as the tank dips into the trench, this shallow angle of track pulls the tank out of the trench, like so, no problem. And it really did work in practice. The design became the standard for the classic tanks of the First World War. Churchill had got his landship, and it evolved rapidly. This is the famous Mark IV version. At 28 tons, it's twice the weight of Little Willie, and its 105 horsepower Daimler engine powered it along at the slightly higher speed of 4 miles an hour. It's this version, more than any other, that changed the face of modern warfare. In 1917, British munitions factories went into overdrive to produce over 1,000 Mark IV tanks. The Mark IV tank carried an 8-man crew, squeezed in here for hours at a time. Tank historian David Fletcher is an authority on these pioneering machines. What was it like inside this tank for the crews going into battle?
All the time you're going along in this thing, the tank is being impacted by machine gun bullets, absolutely continually spattering like heavy rain all around the sides of it.
Right.
The conditions in here are horrifying. When that engine's running, the noise is so loud you can't hear yourself think, never mind anybody else speak. It's generating heat through the exhaust on a tremendous scale, be about the same as a turkey in the oven for Christmas. And there are fumes coming off the thing, great clouds of carbon monoxide. So a lot of the people in the tank are sort of half useless.
The crew needed all their powers of concentration just to drive this machine. To turn it, you had to slow down one track more than the other, and it took 4 people to operate all the brakes and gears, a terrible waste of manpower. In battle, the hail of machine gun fire was so intense that even inside the tank, the crew were far from safe.
The only thing they had by way of personal protection is this, which is a leather face mask with a chainmail bit at the bottom. But these things were issued in order to protect the eyes and face from tiny droplets of lead which would come in through the cracks in the armour, or even bits of armour flaking off the inside when there was impact on the outside. Just try it on for size, have a quick look through, and you'll see the view is better than you'd think.
Yeah, you can see more than you think you're going to see through those slits. But yeah, I suppose after a while, once you perspire, they just sort of slip down the front of the face.
Just slides down your face, and then you can't see anything.
In November 1917, the British deployed 476 Mark IV tanks at the Battle of Cambrai in France. They broke through the German lines, crossed 2 sets of trenches, and advanced 3 miles into enemy territory. It was a great breakthrough. When news reached Britain, the church bells rang in celebration. But by 1918, the Mark IV tank was last year's model.
This is the Mark V, and behind its boiler-plated exterior, it's a whole new beast. A 4-speed manual gearbox and a hand-operated brake for each track meant that this was the first tank that could be driven by one person.
Which freed up the rest of the crew to fight the enemy.
And at the heart of this machine, created by brilliant young engineer Harry Ricardo, is the first engine designed specifically for tanks. And it's a monster.
This 19-litre, 6-cylinder, 4-stroke powerhouse delivers 150 horsepower to the twin tracks.
But for me, the best thing about this fantastic 90-year-old engine is that it still runs. And they've allowed me to start it up. So here we go. There's the starter motor solenoid. Yes.
Gone are the sleeve valves that created all the smoke. In are overhead valves and crosshead pistons.
Sounds absolutely gorgeous, this engine.
The tank didn't win the First World War on its own, but by breaking the deadlock of trench warfare, it tipped the balance in our favour.
For the first time, we had a weapon that was technologically more advanced than anything the Germans had. It boosted British morale and struck terror into the hearts of the enemy. It was, and still is, a great British machine.
In November 1918, the end of the war brought rejoicing on the streets. During the conflict, British engineers had pushed back the frontiers of technology and created a formidable array of new weapons and vehicles. Some of the most extraordinary advances were in the development of flight. And this decade of triumph and tragedy would end with a British aircraft making an heroic voyage that would transform air travel forever. The person who would make it happen was a young pilot called John Alcock.
While flying for the British during the war, Alcock's aircraft crashed, and he found himself stuck in a prisoner of war camp. While he was there, he dreamed of achieving something extraordinary. He knew that no one had ever flown a plane across the Atlantic, and he knew that the Daily Mail were offering a £10,000 prize to the first person to do it. Alcock became determined to win that prize.
Back in Britain after the war, he approached the Vickers Aircraft Company at Brooklands. Fired by his enthusiasm, they agreed to let him pilot one of their planes.
And this is a replica of that aircraft, the Vickers Vimy. It's absolutely extraordinary that anyone would even dream of flying across the Atlantic in this. It's a giant biplane, for goodness sake. It's got an open cockpit and canvas wings.
This is the world's largest flying biplane. It has a 70-foot wingspan and stands over 15 feet high. The Vimy was developed during the war as a bomber to carry out night raids over Germany. It was made possible by massive increases in the power of petrol engines. Alcock's original was equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engines, each capable of delivering a thumping 360 horsepower. And just 16 years into the development of aircraft, a lot of thought was going into aerodynamics.
Wherever possible, the aircraft is streamlined to reduce wind resistance. And if you look at the struts and wires, they're not round, but they're shaped like aerofoils. The undercarriage doesn't retract like a modern aircraft. The best they could do with the original was to cover the wheel with canvas to cut down turbulence from the spokes.
This replica was built in the 1990s, but the maintenance costs are so high that it's heading for retirement in the Brooklands Museum. At least that's the plan.
So the first exercise, it seems, here is to actually get the aircraft out of the hangar.
Today, it's due to make its last ever flight.
There's a few experts here who are lending their wisdom to this initial task.
Hold it, stop!
What we really need is a giant pair of scissors to cut off those flaps there, and then it would come out easily. It's a bit of geometry and physics and coordinated team power.
Okay, gently.
We are only inches to spare this side, so any uncoordinated pull could cause a problem.
Stop!
This magnificent replica is historic in its own right. It has flown thousands of miles along the pioneering routes the original flew 90 years ago.
The Vimy is released from the hangar. Oh, well, here I am at last in the Vimy cockpit. And my first impressions are that you'd have to be very friendly with the person you're sitting next to. Because if you're going to fly the Atlantic in this machine, you're going to be in close quarters for quite a long time. And inside here, the most distinctive feature is this 2/3 of a steering wheel to steer them across the Atlantic.
Everything on this aircraft is controlled by wires. The elevator flaps, which point the plane up and down. The ailerons that roll the aircraft from side to side.
Quite sort of low gearing on those, actually.
And the rudder for turning. And instead of bomb bays, the fuselage is filled with petrol tanks. It all feels very vulnerable. In 1919, Alcock and his navigator, Arthur Brown, needed to move fast. Several other teams were hoping to grab the transatlantic prize.
Everyone realized that the best way to get across the Atlantic was to fly with the strong prevailing winds from west to east. So first, they had to take the aircraft to pieces and ship it to Newfoundland.
By the time Alcock and Brown arrived, attempts by 2 other teams had ended in failure, with their aircraft ditching into the Atlantic. Their chance of success looked slim.